It's Anti-War Radio. We're talking with retired Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Now, you were sure right that this invasion was going to happen, and is that because you had assessed how evil Putin was, or what was it that made you so sure?
No, look, I remember that when McFaul became ambassador under Obama and he presented his credentials, Putin's first words to McFaul were, "You don't listen." And indeed, his predecessor, Ambassador Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, had penned a memorandum. And the memorandum was entitled "No Means No." And it was addressed the whole issue of NATO membership for Ukraine. And of course, this became very important and topical in the aftermath of Georgia. I'm sure many of your listeners will remember that the Russians ultimately intervened in Georgia. And the whole purpose of that intervention was to signal to us that they would not tolerate a NATO member on their borders, particularly a member that was hostile to them, as at the time the Georgian government was. So I think what we're dealing with now is exactly the outcome that Ambassador Burns feared when he said no means no. This is an ongoing problem. This started really under Yeltsin. And it was very embarrassing for the Russians when we decided in 1999 to bring in Poland. The Russians looked at this and they said, you said you weren't going to do this, that you would not fill the vacuum, so to say, with your forces, that once we left, you would not do what you have done and bring in these East European states. We ignored it. We said, oh, well, you have nothing to worry about. It's NATO. But the Russians were very worried, not so much because NATO was hostile at the time, but because they knew that Poland was. Poland has a long history of hostility towards Russia. We brought Poland into the alliance. Poland is, if anything, at this point in time, a potential catalyst for war with Russia. They are very aggressive, even though the Polish population, according to the most recent polls, indicates that 60% of Poles are opposed to a war with Russia. Nevertheless, the government is very aggressive and has talked about sending Polish troops into Ukraine as peacekeepers, which, of course, would precipitate an immediate war with Russia. The Russians would never tolerate that. So we're in a very bad position now because of all these things. And I don't know how we get out of it very easily, but I think if we declare a ceasefire and we adopt neutrality for Ukraine, and then we sit down and listen to the arguments for territorial arrangements that make sense for both sides, I think there's a chance we could come out of this looking pretty good. Unfortunately, we seem to be obstructing. I know that General Keane is telling everyone that the Biden administration is urging Zelensky to sign a ceasefire and to come to terms with the Russians. I hope that's the case, but I haven't seen much evidence for it.
Yeah, well, I sure hope that that's right, too. I mean, the alternative is what? To arm an insurgency and replicate Afghanistan, as Admiral Stavridis says?
Well, that will never happen. And the reason I say never, very simply, is that the Europeans themselves won't permit it. Proxy wars are very dangerous, as you know. You go into a place, not with your own forces, but to arm somebody else to harm ostensibly an opponent that you don't like. Those wars are difficult to control, and those wars can frequently result in the destruction of the people that you allegedly are trying to help. So no, I don't think it will happen, because the Germans will step up, as will other European states, and say, no, wait a minute, you're going to turn Poland into the supply point for weapons and violence against Russia, because they know that at some point that will turn Poland into a target for Russia. Russia will eventually reach the conclusion that the only way to stop an insurgency in Ukraine is to march into and destroy Poland. I think the Polish population electorate understands that, but I don't know about the government at this point. So I don't think that in the final analysis, these notions of proxy war against Russia using other people, as we've used the Ukrainians, is going to work in Europe. I think the Europeans will say, thank you very much, we've had enough of the United States.
Yeah. All right. Now, if it's okay, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the battlefield as it exists now. I guess Mariupol is now firmly in the hands of the Russians. Is that permanent, do you think? What do you think we need to know about what's happening on the ground in the war?
Well, I would say in general terms, Ukraine has been defeated. Ukrainian forces have no mobility. Their only hope for survival has been to move into some urban areas and establish defenses. They know if they move into urban areas where there's a civilian populace and they mix with the civilian populace, this makes it much harder for the Russians to advance. So that's very clear. That's what they've done. The Russians were never, from the very beginning, interested in occupying or conquering territory. They were simply interested in destroying the Ukrainian forces that they saw as a threat, demilitarizing eastern Ukraine, if you will. You'll notice that their ground forces have made very few crossings over the Dnieper River. They don't really want to go into the western part of Ukraine if they can avoid it. So I think that the Russians have accomplished, in broad terms, most of their objectives, but the Russians have never had that many forces. The Ukrainians had 600,000 people at the beginning of this under arms. The Russians came in with less than 200,000. So if you're going to operate that way, as Putin has decided to do, you have to economize in one area so that you can concentrate combat power in another. And right at the moment, we see that outside of Kiev, and we see it also down south outside of Odessa, assuming that he still wants to go to Odessa. I'm not sure that that's the case or ever has been. But if you look at the rest of the region where there are concentrations of Ukrainian forces left, those are now targets for complete destruction. And that's where he's concentrating most of his combat power on the ground. That's in the Donbass and the southern portion of the Donbass region down towards Crimea. That's where I think you're going to see some significant damage done to what remains of Ukrainian forces there. The longer we wait, of course, Scott, as you know, the worse this gets. The more people die. The more people are driven from their homes and move west. We think that right now 10 million people have been displaced. Almost half that number have fled to the west. This, of course, is a catastrophe. It's exactly why it was always in our interest early on to stop this. And then you have the problem internal to Ukraine of planting. We're in the spring. The vast areas of agricultural production have been largely untouched. The Russians don't want to go in there. They want to be able to plant. They want the Ukrainians to be able to plant. And we need to get that done because the food production is vital for the world. We don't seem to understand that in Washington, but the Europeans get it. And I think it's going to become increasingly a problem. We've already taken a terrible hit in the United States because we can't get our hands on fertilizer, most of which comes out of Belarus, Russia, and to a lesser extent, Ukraine. So in other words, there's nothing good happening now. What's happening now is we're sort of bouncing rubble in the east with the Russians against the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are putting up stiff resistance where they can, but that resistance is ultimately futile. They can't win, and they've already effectively lost strategically. That's the problem, and that's what people need to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of America and Russia escalating this conflict into one between the two of us, not just as a proxy war, I wonder, how worried you are about that. For, one thing, I read a piece, I'm pretty sure it's the New York Times, where they talked about, we couldn't give them fighter jets because a fighter jet could be used to attack Moscow, like, frankly, right? That could be an offensive weapon. So that would be going too far. But giving them Stinger missiles to take out Russian aircraft, we're just sure we can get away with that. And in fact, giving intelligence to the Ukrainians, which they obviously have been doing for the past weeks here in the war, that there's even articles in NBC and I'm pretty sure the New York Times saying that the administration has discussed how these are, legally speaking, acts of war that make us co-belligerents in the war. But then the article is just, how cheeky and smart they are to know that they can get away with it and what's Putin going to do about it, which is, I'm pretty sure, what they were saying last October. But, I don't know.
Well, Scott, you've just cut through the nonsense with laser-like precision. At this point, people in Washington have turned out to be just about 100% wrong about everything that would happen. You talked about my comments that I made in December and then again in January at the National Interest, predicting that, yes, the Russians will intervene in eastern Ukraine, and talked about this being a limited operation, provided we did not expand it. Well, lots of people in Washington took issue with that. I've got lots of feedback at the time saying, oh, no, you're wrong. Putin would never do that. He's no fool. That will hurt Russia. Kept trying to explain to people that for the Russians, what happens in Ukraine is an existential matter. Ukraine is not some distant country in North Africa. Ukraine sits right next to Russia. Russia will not tolerate foreign forces and capabilities on the ground inside a country that is hostile to them that could conceivably threaten their existence. I've drawn the analogy with Mexico, trying to say to people, don't you understand what we would do if the Russians or the Chinese or someone else established a force in Mexico? And people forget that the French did that between 1860 and 1865. And when the Civil War ended, we marched an army of 50,000 to the border with Mexico and made it clear to the French that if they didn't get out of Mexico, we would invade and destroy them. We didn't mince words about it, and with good reason. It was on our borders. The Russians take the same position. So the real issue is this. The Russians are not leaving Ukraine until they get what they want. It's not going to happen. They can stay there forever if necessary. That's the view. Putin's support now is about 83% approval rating, maybe higher. If anything, we've destroyed what goodwill we had inside the Russian population, and we've hardened their position indefinitely. On top of that, he's got China, India, the peninsular Arabs now who control much of the oil and gas in the Middle East and North Africa, along with numbers of important countries like Brazil in Latin America, other states in Africa and Southeast Asia. The Japanese have said, well, we'll do a little of what you wanted. We'll go ahead and honor some sanctions, but we will continue to buy oil and gas from Russia. And oh, by the way, our joint exploration in Sakhalin Island, north of Japan, where you have some of the greatest deposits of natural gas and oil in the world, well, we Japanese are going to continue to work with the Russians. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So if you look at NATO and you look at Scholz, who's absolutely in over his head at this point, he's worried about hundreds of thousands of Germans in the streets protesting because the gas and the oil have been cut off and the energy is gone. You have a similar concern today in Italy. Italy is an enormous economy, and the population there has no interest whatsoever in this war in Ukraine against Russia. The governments in Europe are afraid. They're afraid that they will not survive this. They won't say it publicly, but privately, they've made that very clear. So when you ask, is Russia winning or Ukraine is winning? Well, Ukraine is definitely losing and has lost terribly as a result of this. Russia, yes, Russia is going to win this encounter, but it's an encounter they would rather have avoided, and it's an encounter that we should have avoided. But we were unwilling to listen to them, unwilling to consider the legitimate interests and concerns of other states. We have been bullying everyone for decades. This is now going to come to an end. You can't bully Russia. It's not Iraq.
Yeah. Now, very little time left here, but just real quick, I know you're familiar with the counter narrative, which is that this philosopher, Alexander Dugin, says that Putin has to make Russia great again by reincorporating all Russian-speaking peoples in the world and recreating the Tsarist Empire, if not the Soviet Union, and nothing short of total victory will do. And that's his Mein Kampf, and that any security concerns raised by the Russians as excuses for their actions are merely after-the-fact rationalizations for this insane policy that, of course, means that we must strengthen NATO in order to contain this newly aggressive Hitlerian madman, Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, well, Putin is in charge, not this man, Dugin. And Dugin is exactly what you said. He's kind of a philosopher / political scientist. And no doubt that he's saying things when he's given the opportunity. But I don't see any evidence that Putin is committed to some crusade the way we are. We have been committing ourselves for the last 30 years to this open-ended war on everyone that doesn't want to adopt our notions of liberal democracy, everyone who will not submit to the dominance of our financial system, everyone who refuses to recognize that our enemies are their enemies. So I think this is kind of a mirror imaging exercise. I think what Putin wants is economic development, prosperity, and stability. He was afraid of what we were doing in Ukraine. He acted in Crimea because he wasn't prepared to stand by and watch NATO navies dock in Crimea and set up forces and capabilities there that could threaten Russia. We have continually refused to acknowledge those things. It's disastrous. We got to stop it. This is why I had hoped that Biden might be a moderating influence. In retrospect, it's turned out that he's exacerbated all the tensions and made matters much, much worse. I just hope that we can somehow or another stay out of it, at least not become involved, because this will resolve itself, as you point out, Scott. The handwriting is on the wall. The question is not if Zelensky or whoever represents the Ukrainian people commit to a new relationship with Russia in the form of a treaty. It's a question of when. And the sooner it happens, the better for the Ukrainians.
All right, you guys, that is retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor. You can find him in the American Conservative magazine. His latest there is called Is There a Path to Peace in Ukraine? Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you, Scott.